Thank you for coming out tonight and joining us this evening on our second Southbound lecture of the season. My name is Darcy Welch, and I'm the Executive Director of the Southern Lit Alliance. We are proud to present Southbound Lectures as a meaningful part of Chattanooga's cultural scene, as well as its impact in our local schools. Adrian will visit GPS, Girls Preparatory School, tomorrow as part of our Writers in the Classroom program. These visits offer Chattanooga students a multi-dimensional perspective of the literary arts and inspire creativity, which is so important to our mission. Adrian Matejka was born in Nuremberg, Germany, and grew up in California and Indiana. He is a graduate of Indiana University and the MFA program at Southern Illinois University, Carbondale. His first collection of poems, The Devil's Garden, won the 2002 New England Award from Alice James Books. His second collection, Mixology, was a winner of the 2008 National Poetry Series and was published by Penguin Books in 2009. Mixology was a finalist for the NAACP Image Award for Outstanding Literature and Poetry. His most recent book, The Big Smoke, was awarded the 2014 Anisfield Wolf Book Award. The Big Smoke was also a finalist for the 2013 National Book Award, the 2014 Hurston Wright Legacy Award, and the 2014 Pulitzer Prize in Poetry. He's a winner of the Julia Peterkin Award, the Eugene and Marilyn Glick Indiana Authors Award, and fellowships from Cave Canem, the Guggenheim Foundation, and Lannan Foundation. His work has appeared in American Poetry Review, Gulf Coast, Plowshares Poetry, and Prairie Schooner, among other journals and anthologies. He is the Lilly Professor, Poet in Residence at Indiana University in Bloomington, and is currently working on a new collection of poems and a graphic novel. Please welcome Adrian Matejka.
Thank you so much, Darcy, for that great introduction, and thank you, Rhett and Jed. I don't know where Jed is, but I'm feeling you. Thank you. Thank you so much for picking me up at the airport and showing me Chattanooga. I love this city already. I've met people that I never expected to meet, and I've worked Brazen into a signature on a book. So I'm going to just read poems from The Big Smoke today. I thought that would be appropriate for Black History Month, and also because Jack Johnson's just really fantastic. I'm going to read for maybe 25 minutes, and then I think we're going to have a little bit of Q&A afterward. So thank you again for coming and for taking your time tonight with us, the Southern Lit Alliance's boss. Okay. So Jack Johnson was the first African-American heavyweight champion of the world. That's him. He won the heavyweight championship in 1908 by beating a guy named Tommy Burns. Jack Johnson's parents were slaves, so he was the first generation after emancipation. He won the heavyweight title in 12 years after Plessy versus Ferguson. So what we're talking about is a space where black men and women were barely considered human and had little, if any, rights at all. So here's Jack Johnson, who fights his way to the heavyweight championship, which had up to that point always been a white man, and almost always an American white man too. And once he gets there, he proceeds to marry a white woman and live this lifestyle that was unprecedented for an African American at the time. In between, he taught himself how to play the viol classically. He memorized Shakespeare and Kipling, and he became an all-around gentleman in the best sense of the word back then. There's more, but I'm going to read some poems and I'll tell you about it as we go along. The people that we're going to hear from, Etta is his wife. She shows up in some of the poems, and Tommy Burns, like I said, is the guy that he beat. Battle Royale. Back then, they'd chain a bear in the middle of the bear garden and let the dogs loose. Iron chains around a bear's neck don't slow him too much. A bear will always make short work of a dog. Shakespeare said Sackerson did it more than 20 times to dogs and wildcats alike, and since most creatures were naturally afraid of bears, there wouldn't always be much of a show in the bear garden. So the handler sometimes took the bear's eyes or put the teeth out to make the fight more sporting. I believe you need eyes more than you need teeth in a fight, but losing either makes a bear a little less mean. Once baiting was against the law, some smart somebody figured coloreds would fight just as hard if hungry enough. So they rounded up the skinniest of us, had us stripped to trousers, then blindfolded us before the fight. They turned us in hard circles a few times on the ring steps like a motor car engine before pushing us between the ropes. When the bell rang, it seemed like I got hit from 8 directions. I didn't know where those punches came from, but I swung so hard my shoulder hadn't been right since, because the man said only the last darky on his feet gets a meal. Prize fighter. I love horses because they will outrun the fastest man. They are majestic, as stately as a Saturday woman before a party. Horses smell like what it means to be fast, sweat and gravel kicked up on early morning runs, the in and out of breath like gravel in tired lungs. I groomed and raced horses from Texas to Philadelphia till one broke a leg bone with a back kick. Thanks to that break, I can't ride anymore, and even if I could, we got these automobiles now, and they can carry us a mile a minute. I'm buying the fastest one of these things I can find once I get my money together, because I'm like an automobile in the ring. My fists work like cranked up engines. I've got the kind of elasticity other fighters dream about when I put them to sleep on the canvas. When I clinch a man, it's like being swallowed in forgiveness. When I hook a man, it's like being hit by frustration. I can't tell if these horses are happy or confounded by this new means of locomotion, but I can say with certainty, my prize fighting cohorts are decidedly dissatisfied by my presence. That's a direct quote, decidedly dissatisfied by my presence. So Jack Johnson, so in 1910, there were 100,000 cars in the entire United States, from coast to coast, and Jack Johnson owned 5 cars. He used to talk about how he could wreck a car and go pick one up the next day. That sounds familiar, right? So, I'm going to read a poem where he's in his car. This is called Chicken and Other Stereotypes. And just like almost all the poems in this book, it's true. This actually happened. Chicken and Other Stereotypes. The officer said, "Nigga, where's the chicken?" and started inspecting the seats of my automobile before I could say anything. It was another one of those cold Chicago days, and me and Hattie were standing in the middle of Wabash while this officer slapped the flyer seats with his straightening club. I'd be the first to admit my automobile has plush seats, but not plush enough for a chicken heist. Like I would stash a stolen hen where I sit. Back in Galveston, folks name their fowls and talk about those birds like old friends. I offered to pay a fine, but the officer and his straightening club dangling from his wrist like an extra arm wouldn't hear any of it. He saw I had a money roll in my pocket bulging like a teacup, and he still kept searching. Finally, I told him, "Mr. Officer, please understand, no stolen chicken has ever passed the portals of my face. Those chickens see the gleam in my eye, and they keep out of my way." Another direct quote. So Jack Johnson was one of the first trash talkers, and you see in some of these fight scenes, like you can see him leaned over talking and smiling at the people he's fighting. And so you can imagine when they were already feeling as if Jack Johnson wasn't supposed to be part of the conversation, this black man talking all that trash, it was not ideal. But they used to call that kind of, what we call trash talk, they used to call it mouth fighting, which makes a lot more sense to me as a name. Mouth fighting. Sometimes the fight is over even before we split the ropes. The fighter's glass jaw, a cut of his costume, the absence of pretty women in his entourage, all fair game for the mouth fight. Never mothers or children, never wives or crippled relatives, or women at all unless they're sporting women. There's always something else to talk about. A civilized mouth fight is about making a fighter wild, and as soon as I can tell he's listening, I know I've won. Yellow fighters like Tommy Burns want to tear out when the talk starts. You can see their knees knocking as clearly as spoons in a vaudeville show. Others lose composure, and that's when it's over. How is a fighter supposed to think about defense when he's trying to get at me by whatever means necessary? That's why the mouth is the most devastating weapon. And mine shies to high heaven every time I take a swing. So I should probably explain what sports are. So back in Jack Johnson's time, the kind of guy who was a gambler, kind of hustler, kind of fellow like that, they used to call them sports, right? They'd wear fancy clothes, run around doing kind of cool things that other people don't get to. They called the lifestyle that they lived the sporting life. So if you're one of these people that was attached to athletes and money and gambling, that's the sporting life. And the women that ran around with them were called sporting women. Sporting life. And this poem is a direct quote, the whole poem. People are always talking about if and suppose, like those words are worth more than money, more than the crease a silk stocking makes on a woman's thigh, more than the grumble of a Thomas Flyer engine. So I take the sides of my pleasure, two small words, if and suppose, and nobody can explain them. We get in this world what we're gonna get. After all, one man can roll out of bed and be killed while another man falls from a scaffold and lives. A man can get a bullet in the brain and keep his life, while some other poor sap, he dies from a shot in the leg. It's all luck and perspective. Pleasure is both to me. So that's him. That's him talking. I changed like 3 words. But when I was doing the research for this, I'm finding all these quotes in newspapers where he sounds like buckwheat or somebody. Because, somebody who sounds like that is problematic if your idea is an African-American man is not a human, right? You can't let him sound like that. So this is Stanley Ketchel, and he's fighting Jack Johnson right now, so maybe I'll read a poem with Stan Ketchel in it. This poem is called A Struggle Between a Demon and a Gritty Little Dwarf. And that came from the Baltimore American. They described this fight as that. The longer the fight lasts, the more the moving picture rights are worth. That's why I kept Ketchel off the canvas. He might have called himself the assassin, but I played with him in the ropes like a cat does a mouse, lacing him just enough to bring blood for the show. That's what a prize fight is, a show. The better man almost always wins, but we all have to play our part in the spectacle. Ketchel's handlers dressed him up for his part as a heavyweight using high boots and extra coats, but underneath it all, he was strictly a middleweight. And I picked him up, held him high so his feet dangled like a Sunday chicken on that special morning. Then I smiled at the only colored in the crowd, hatless, next to all those whites in their bowlers and bright ribbon fedoras. I heard Ketchel's second slap the canvas and yell, "Now then, Stanley." But I didn't see the double cross coming until Ketchel's hook stung me behind the ear. I dropped, stopped my fall with my glove before I hit the canvas. The referee started counting and the buzzing sound started inside my ears like a crowd before the fight. All those spectators hoping Ketchel would put me down. The crowd quieted when I smiled my gold smile and punched the dust off my gloves, quiet enough to hear me hit him so hard we both fell down. Quiet enough to hear the 1, 2, 3 of his teeth hitting canvas like chicken scratch. 2 of his uppers got stuck in my glove. Quiet as Ketchel sprawled like he was counting the clouds, the referee counting them out slowly for fear of his own skin. I didn't show I was scared, but I was. I leaned casually on that top rope, waiting for a twitch, a breath, any sign the man would be a man again. This poem is called Alias, and it's made up of all names that Jack Johnson was given in the newspaper. So like I said, some newspaper reporters would write it straight. Others of them were incredibly racist, as you can imagine. And these names came from like the LA Times and the Dallas Morning Star, like places that are real, it wasn't like the Bloomington Herald where I live, so that kind of stuff. Alias. And this is a sonnet too. Alias. John Arthur Johnson, Jack Johnson, Lil Arthur, Jack Johnson. Tiniest boy, Jack. Yellow streak nigga. Bold Mr. Johnson, Jack Johnson. The Big Smoke, Jack Johnson. Flash nigga, Jack Johnson. The Big Cinder, Black Animal, Jack. Texas watermelon pickaninny, Mr. Johnson. Colored man with cash, colored champion, the colored winner, Gentleman Jack, Jack Johnson. Galveston Giant, the heavyweight champion, Smoke. The Big Ethiopian, fresh nigga, the man they all dodge, Papa Jack, Champion Jack, Jack Johnson, Papa Jack. I don't even know how it's possible to, I don't know. I don't even know. All right, so this fight was against Jim Jeffries, who was the heavyweight champion before Jack Johnson won the title. He retired instead of fighting Jack Johnson. So there's a very long poem in the book about this fight, which I'm not going to read, but instead I'll just sneak in another fighting poem instead, since there's boxing going on. This is called A Great Maltese Cat Toying with a White Mouse, and that's another quote from a newspaper headline. It's 2 parts, and they're both sonnets. What I told the reporters. I had no doubt about the outcome after the first round. The only surprise was how long Tommy Burns stayed on his feet. He was a game man and showed no inclination whatsoever to quit. My fists were better in every round, and I landed punches I thought would bring him down. But like a great pachyderm, he refused to stop. And because he was so game, I was glad the police ended the fight. I wanted to be heavyweight champion, not injure Burns seriously. What I really meant. That man made me chase him from Texas to England, all the way to Australia before he would fight me. Four-flusher. He didn't win the title. He just happened to be white in the right place, like somebody striking gold. I put him down, but gently in the first round, so he'd know what was to come when he got his knee off the canvas. Once he collected himself, I bruised him with my right and talked to him all the while. Walk right into him, Tommy. Left hook to the gut. That's a boy, Tommy. Straight right to the cheek. Take your medicine nicely. So I'm going to read maybe 4 more poems. I want to get into some of this stuff. So Jack Johnson, when he married a woman named Etta Doria, who was a Long Island socialite, and she's got a cycle of poems in the book, but I'm not going to, I've never felt like I could read them well. If you picked up the book, I hope you'll read them because it's really important. She's really important. But I'm going to read some poems that she pops up in. Jack Johnson absolutely 100% loved her, but he also had 2 mistresses. This is called Rememory. I've forgotten some prize fights and the names of men I beat more than they beat me. But how can I forget that horse divine intervention with this scar divided my thigh like Wabash splits Chicago? That horse back kicked so hard my leg bone broke and split my skin like a lazy plum. I stayed back in that stall bleeding and hollering in the dirty hay with that horse looking over my shoulder like it was my fault. And the flies humming, stuttering like telegraph type until Jim found me. I couldn't tolerate horses after that. The scar is purple now and jagged as a pants hem. Even though the bone healed all right, I rubbed the scar for luck. Most times I forget I'm rubbing it until Etta reminds me. Ticket on the Titanic. Etta and I had no intention of missing the maiden voyage of the finest ship built for man, but Captain Smith drew the color line almost as quickly as Tommy Burns did. I expect the line from a fighting prize fighter, but an English sea captain, he should be more principled, especially after I offered $4,000 for each one of those tickets. Of course, the color line kept me from fighting for Etta's space on the lifeboat when that iceberg hit. That is a fight you could bet your last copper I would have won. And even after all the offense I suffered and all the indignity of being refused passage, I would have never danced the Eagle Rock while all those people drowned. So there's a very famous Leadbelly song called The Titanic, and in it Jack Johnson's dancing the Eagle Rock when the Titanic goes down. And he would have never done that. because it just wouldn't have looked good, the optics. And he was really aware of the optics of things, as long as it didn't involve his wife or his mistresses. So the last poem I'm going to read is called Il Trovatore, and Jack Johnson's favorite piece of music of all was Verdi's opera Il Trovatore. And he had this he had this manservant, like he had this valet who he would make carry around he'd make him carry a gramophone around with him and play Il Trovatore while he worked out, like the first boombox or something. So this is called Il Trovatore after that. The first time I heard the aria, it was like sunup after the great storm, the woman's voice rising, then rising more, as if the want of it all wouldn't allow her another breath. Like road work when you've punched yourself out, like Tommy Burns catching my gut hook, like the first I saw of Etta, like the sound of the crowd in Reno when Jeffries couldn't go on, like going up the steps of the Café de Champion, across gunshots in Etta's rooms, like a halo of blood getting bigger by the minute around Etta, like the gun in Etta's in his hand still hot, Etta still breathing, like the nurses not nursing but crying and pointing at that gun still hot in Etta's hand, like realizing Etta's still breathing and whispering a libretto on the heels of her last breath. You did this, Papa. You did all of this. Thank you. No, it's okay. You can just leave it. Yeah, hopefully it'll just stop at some point. There's like another 3 minutes on the video, but I just didn't want to. So there's, at the end of this video, we might see, I just didn't want to get caught in it, is this Jack Johnson, like maybe probably 25 years later, after he was heavyweight champion, performing. And he talks about, like well, if it comes up, you'll see it. But he's so elegant and very eloquent in his way he's talking about, and he directs this little orchestra and playing the Tiger Rag, or pretends to direct it, and so you get to actually hear what he sounds like. But I just forgot to ask.
Can we just see if I can get the sound down?
Yeah, if it's easy, I mean it's.
It might just be a matter of it's a different source, but let me just see if I can play. Go continue.
Yeah, no, it's okay. We'll see if this. Sorry, technology. It allows you to see him, which is awesome, right? I mean, these are some really herky-jerky films, but they're. It's pretty impressive. So this is right here is fighting Fireman Jim Flynn, which was he was kind of a tomato can, if you guys know what a tomato can is. He was not much of a fighter at all, and so Jack Johnson picked him to fight so he wouldn't have to work very hard after he was heavyweight champion. Yeah, it's like, I think it's the last 2 minutes maybe. So we'll see. So as I'm standing up here doing this, we'll see if it works. But yeah, I'm trying to think. Oh, I was going to tell you the story about the Titanic. So I had this idea, as you probably have seen, you heard in those poems, that Jack Johnson was was a very bold and like kind of forthright dude with lots of ego and lots of bombast, and he was, but he was also really brilliant. He knew what he needed to do. He knew he needed to be a showman, right? So I wrote this poem about the Titanic, responding to Leadbelly's song, thinking that Jack Johnson would be like, well, I'd fight my way on those lifeboats, and Ed and I would sail off into the sunset. I had this whole narrative in my head about how the two of them would they were going to be on those lifeboats. And it went through, the editors at Penguin were like, we like this, everybody's excited about the poem. And then it happened to be like the anniversary of the Titanic, maybe 2 days before I was supposed to send the book in for good. And I listened to this documentary on NPR in my car about how there was only one man that was on any of the lifeboats after the Titanic, because a gentleman wouldn't get on the lifeboat. A gentleman would go down with the ship. So it was just women and children and this one guy who got on for some reason. Right? Well, I mean, I know why I would have got on. But but they, at their time, right? Like you're supposed to sit on the band's playing, you all go down drinking champagne and smoking cigars or whatever, right? And so I had this whole thing where Jack Johnson's punching his way on the lifeboats and everything, and one of the editors at Penguin's like, this is my favorite poem. Like, me too. And it turns out to be completely wrong. And so if I had put this out there, Jack Johnson would have not only been a coward, right? He would have been this coward, which was one of the accusations that they leveled against black fighters to begin with. But it was just also historically and factually inaccurate, right? So there was this one man whose name, unfortunately, I cannot remember, who got on the lifeboats, the only adult, even though there was space. People could have got on, but all the men stayed on the Titanic and went down. So for this one guy who 3 years after the Titanic sank, killed himself because he was so ashamed of being the only man that got on the. So contemporary masculinity is kind of a messed up construction, right? But look at that version of that version of it. Well, I'm just going to die to prove that I'm a man. I wasn't cut out for 1910. So, all right, this is almost over. Like I said, that fight is pointless. It doesn't even pop up in the book, but I like it because if you can, when he does look at the camera, he's smiling the whole time and just hemming this guy up, not even trying very hard. And that's pretty much the way that he fought. The only time he tried was when he really wanted to embarrass somebody. The rest of the time, he would just make it a show.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have been requested by many to tell just how I knocked out so many of my opponents. And as far as I'm concerned, that day has gone. And today, I have a new way in knocking them out. And I will show you.
It's been like that piano player's cracking up the whole time, too. It's just like yeah. So now you understand why I wanted to work on this book. I mean, that guy he's incredible. He's magnetic, problematic, beautiful, and all these other things kind of rolled up into one. And the more work I did, the more I was both attracted to and sort of repelled by parts of his biography. And so, yeah, I mean, I worked on this book for 8 years. And then I've spent another 2 finishing the graphic novel. So it's been a 10-year project, and we were talking about this earlier. This is like, now it's somebody else's story to carry once this graphic novel comes out. So did you have questions about this?
So the graphic novel is the story of...
So the graphic novel, when I started working on this book, there was so much material that I knew I couldn't get it all in one text. And so I decided it was going to be 2 books, but I didn't know what the 2 were going to be. And so I ended up deciding kind of midway through that I wanted to do a book that was completely different, like a totally different genre approach and construction than this was, because I couldn't do this again. Even if I wanted to, I couldn't write one of the poems in this book again. It's just, that was where I was before, right? And so I decided to do a graphic novel. I can't illustrate, I mean, I'm drawing stick figures, right? But I have this really brilliant illustrator that I work with. So I wrote a script like you would write a script for a movie, and then he's filling it in for me. And it's taking a very long time. I'd hoped to show some of the pages from it tonight, but they just weren't. He just didn't feel comfortable with it being out in the world yet. So yeah, once that's done though, it's set in 1920 and goes backward. So for those of you that don't know much about Jack Johnson, other than maybe what I was filling in for you, in 1913 he was convicted of the Mann Act, which is taking a woman across state lines for the purposes of prostitution. And this was totally trumped up kind of thing, but it was the way that they were trying to get him out of the heavyweight championship, but also, which I think they would have been all right with. It was when he married Etta that the problems really started. Like, they were upset about him, but there wasn't a huge push to get rid of him in the same way. And then when he showed up with this white wife who was a socialite, and they were like, oh no, that's not working. That's where the idea of the Great White Hope showed up. And then all of a sudden they started bringing all these fighters to try to beat Jack Johnson and get that title back from him. So I think that, they were looking for ways, they being the sort of larger establishment, were looking for ways to get rid of Jack Johnson to begin with. And then when Etta killed herself, Jack Johnson remarried. He married another white woman like 3 weeks later. And that was like the thing, and forgive the language, but they were like, oh hell no, you don't get to do that. You don't get to, you just buried her and you're gonna marry someone else? Oh no. And so within months, he got slapped with these Mann Act charges. They found one of his former mistresses to corroborate the charges, and it was a total railroad job. He swears up and down that he spent about $50,000 greasing palms of constables and judges and FBI agents, and they're all these people are saying the same thing. Like, he did what you do in Chicago, right? He paid all these people off to get out of trouble, and he still went, still got convicted and was supposed to go to prison. But instead, he ran, and he moved to Europe, and he lived in Europe for 5 years until he had to leave around World War I. So the graphic novel picks up after he's come back to take his lumps, and he's in prison, and goes backward and looks at the time when he was running around Europe, hanging out with the Dadaist poets and kings and queens. Everybody outside of the United States loved Jack Johnson, but just here, as the child of emancipated slaves, it was never going to work for him. He ended up moving to Mexico for a while and hanging out with Pancho Villa. And when that kind of went sour, he went and hung out with Emilio Zapata, and he would just like bounce back and forth making money off of them. He started a company called the Jack Johnson Land Company in Mexico City to bring this like first generation of emancipated slaves to Mexico to farm. Didn't quite work out. He was really good at coming up with ideas for things, but not such a good businessman. So anyway, all of that is in the graphic novel. We explore this sort of weird experience after he left the United States, which is both really amazing, but also this kind of thing that you can't do anymore, right? You can't be like that, like a person of the world. You can't be a man or a woman of the world where you just bumble into revolutions and events all the time the way that he did back then. It just doesn't happen like that anymore. If you're inside of a revolution, you're lucky to get out of that country at all. But he would just go from one to the next. It was really a different time in that way. So, do you have questions about this? I mean, it's a strange space. Yeah, Jen.
So one of the things I was curious about, the book sort of jumps from height to his prize-fighting career.
Mm-hmm.
It skips or only peripherally treats the Mann Act stuff, and then goes to the end where he's kind of a showman, maybe verging on being a hucksterish kind of a showman.
Yeah, like this kind of stuff.
Kind of what drove the, and it sounds like you used that material for another kind of so that partially answers it, but why did you skip that stuff for the poetry? What kind of guided you in
Well,
that direction?
that was exactly it. Like, I wanted this to be about how he got to where he got, and then I wanted the next book to kind of deal with the rest of the stuff. I mean, if we're honest with ourselves as readers and consumers of story, most people don't like the part of the story that goes down. They like the part of the story that goes up, right? And so trying to figure, it was also a business decision in ways. Like, I thought, okay, if I'm going to put these two projects side by side, which one should be out there first? Which one needs to be there to set up the other one? And I couldn't go backwards. I couldn't have the second part. Even if I conceived it earlier, I I needed to show why someone might be interested in him if they didn't know him before you, because nobody cares about an ex-con, right? Like that's just like the sad truth of our culture. Is like as soon as you know that they've been in prison, all of a sudden, doesn't matter how brilliant they are, it just all of a sudden dismisses value in some ways to some people. And so the fact that Jack Johnson was not only a convicted felon, but also a black convicted felon, you have to generate sympathy in some other way, right? So, I mean, I don't want to get too like nuts and bolts writery about it, but that's the way I was thinking about it. Was okay, what do I need to do to show people how brilliant he was, and hopefully have them interested in learning more about him, so they'll stay with him when things aren't good. Yeah, that's the other part. Who wants to hang around a sad sack? You know what I mean? He's in his mind, he's out in the world. He's Jack Johnson. He's this guy, but that's the only place he's this guy. He's broke. You know, he's on the run. I had this file from the FBI. They were called the Department of Justice back then, but it's what the FBI. And they followed Jack Johnson around for 4 years. And they would send all these telegrams back to the home office in Chicago. Yeah, he's here. We can take him in if you want. And the director was like, no, he'll come back on his own. We don't need to spend the money bringing him back. Just keep an eye on him. And so Jack Johnson would be writing letters to his friends in the States saying, oh, I'm in Paris. I'm living like a king. Everybody's treating me like, the gentleman I am. And these agents would be sending these telegrams and letters back saying he's broke. They're living in his flop house. His wife is about to leave him, And then he's like doing narratives I thought would be really useful and fascinating if I could put them together in a form that would be, that could hold them both. And holding both of those in a poem is hard. But having somebody draw these things, all you have to do is have someone draw him in a flop house and have his letter saying I'm living like a king, and you show the dichotomy. So hopefully it'll be cool, and hopefully it'll show the respect to him and to Etta and to the other characters that I was trying to show. I mean, they're all so fascinating and valuable, even in their failures. So I wanted to show respect to those things. You just reminded me of something when I was answering that. So I sent a copy of this book to President Obama, right? Because there have been 3 different unanimous resolutions passed through Congress to pardon Jack Johnson, and they get to the president, and President Bush wouldn't sign them. One came up to President Obama when his first term, and he wouldn't sign it. And it's up there again now. It's just sitting on his desk. And so I had this moment of this delusion of grandeur that maybe if he read this book, he says, because he likes poetry, because the president likes poetry. So like, if he just read these poems, he'd be like, oh, I've got to pardon this guy, or however he does it, all straight up and down, But it turns out that Eric Holder said that they're saving their pardons for people who are alive, and so there's not a lot of push. And now that I never heard back either. Man, come on, it's like $18. Come on, dude. I don't get them for free. I got to pay for them too. Yeah.
Do you have any connection with his relatives?
With Jack Johnson's, I've had contact with them now. He has a great niece who's sort of positioned herself as the spokesperson for their family, and I found out about her after the book was out. So I sent her some copies of the book, and she was really excited about it, and that was good. I think they're trying to figure out a way to kind of consolidate his legacy, but it's a really hard thing to do. He's a historical figure, and you can't own a historical figure. So they're trying to figure out how to I don't know what the agenda in the end is, but I think that they want to be able to somehow, be careful with the way how his legacy is treated. Because there was that movie, The Great White Hope, right? That was a play as well. And the play won the Pulitzer Prize. Howard Sackler's play won the Pulitzer Prize. And it's a blatant rips off Jack Johnson's history, but it doesn't really treat it with any respect. It sort of takes the salacious part and blows it up. And for those of you who have seen this movie, it's James Earl Jones does a really, really great job, and Jane Alexander is amazing, but the language is terrible. He sounds like this hillbilly, and It's all wrong. It's not who he actually was, but they took the part that people were stressed out about. This enormous black athlete married to a white woman in 1910. And they took that and made the story about that. Not about his parents being slaves and him figuring out how to do this on his own. Not about him teaching himself how to read and recite poetry or how to play classical music or any of those. None of that's in The Great White Hope. It's just the salacious part. And so when the play was coming around in Chicago, some of the cast members of the play took it upon themselves to want to change Jack Johnson's headstone. He's buried in Graceland Cemetery with like Otis from Otis Elevators and the guy who started Pullman Porters. He's in there with all these captains of industry from the turn of the century, right? And Ed is buried next to him on one side, and his last wife's buried on the other. But they took it upon themselves to change this very plain but, you know, imposing kind of headstone that just says Johnson on it, big monolith, to this one that said Lil Arthur, which is a name that he hated. And they almost were able to get away with it, but Jack Johnson's family stepped in and interrupted it. And so to kind of keep those kind of things from happening, I think they want to have a little more say in the way that things are done around his legacy. You know, it doesn't really apply to creative text, though, so they're in a kind of a bind in terms of what they can do and how they can protect it. And so,
What year was that played?
76 maybe, 77. But you know, I mean, I was cracking, we were joking about Pulitzer Prize winners and how awesome that is, right? So he won the Pulitzer Prize on Jack Johnson's story, right? Like I got close on Jack Johnson's story. And so I think it's safe to say it has nothing to do with the writers, it has to do with this story, right? I mean, I think that's the moral of the story is somebody treats his story, even if they disrespect it, apparently. It's an interesting enough and American enough tale that people will be engaged in it.
Was there any kind of evolution in public perception of him generally in America? Did it adjust after he got sent away? Any kind of sympathy, or was there always just this consistent stream of hatred?
Yeah, it's more that. More a kind of constant hatred, and I mean, and things. I mean, it shifted in some ways. So when Jack Johnson first became the heavyweight champion, I mean, as you can imagine, the African American community was like, right? Look what we've done. Everybody, just about like to a person, was enthusiastic about Jack Johnson being in the black community, except Booker T. Washington and his followers. And Mike and I were talking about this the other day, like the Booker T's followers, if Booker T himself and his followers were like, this guy is terrible for the black community. I mean, look at him. I didn't even read this poem. I meant to. I just got caught up looking at him. I have this poem about his teeth. Like he's got gold fronts like a rapper, right? But this is 1908. And so he's got these gold teeth and all these pictures of him, he's smiling and you can see like the gleaming sun off his gold teeth or whatever. And you know, somebody's a person like that is magnetic and engaging, but if you want the community to be humble and wait for their turn and be, you know, respectful and quiet like Mr. Washington did, then Jack Johnson is he's antithetical to that, right? So most of the community embraced this kind of brash persona and the fact that he would just go and do what he wanted to do and live this life. You know, there's this great story about Jack Johnson and how he would speed all the time. You know, he died in a car accident. He ran into a tree, speeding away from a diner that wouldn't serve him in 1946, right? But he was like a speed demon, like always wrecking cars, always having problems in this way. And there's this old story that he was driving through some town in the South, and he's driving through, and the cop stops him. And it's like, it'll be $50 for that speeding ticket, you know, which is exorbitant. I think the actual ticket was like 50 cents or something. They're gonna be like, it's $50. And Jack Johnson gave him 100. He was like, here you go. And the guy's like, well, I don't have change for 100. He's like, no, just keep it. I'll be back in a little bit, and I'm gonna be going the same speed. So that like that kind of attitude is ingratiating to some people, but not like Booker T. Washington. And so but the more heat that Jack Johnson got in his personal life, and when he would beat these great white hopes it would get taken out on the black community in places in our country. And so, you know, once that started happening, people were a little less, jubilant about his successes. And so, you know, I mean, the thing to remember or to keep in mind about him in particular, which is unlike any other, hardly any other public figure we have, is that at the time Jack Johnson was doing these things, someone could have murdered him. Somebody could have killed him right where he stood, and there would have been a parade for that person. Like every day Jack Johnson left his house, he ran the risk of somebody killing him, and, you know.
Did he get deputies?
Oh, all the time. And, you know, and it was, I don't know how one would live under that kind of pressure. I mean, it's hard enough on a regular day. If you live in the wrong neighborhood, it's hard to get up and leave that, your house in those neighborhoods sometimes, right? But if every single, well, not every, but nearly every person around you is frustrated by your presence, like your very existence, and all they have to do is pull a trigger and it's over, and they know they're not going to get in trouble, that is a terrifying. I don't know how he made it, to be honest with you. It's one of the things, I don't know how he dealt with the things he dealt with, and I do not know how he survived. Like, I have no idea what it was that allowed him to make it through the way he did. Because we have all these stories in our history of people who did, 1/100th of the things that he did and were lynched or, otherwise murdered. It's so the fact that he was able to get away with it on some level is extraordinary. Yeah.
Seems like a larger-than-life character, certainly.
Yeah.
Sort of Shakespearean in a way. The boxers are violent people.
Mm-hmm.
Was he a violent person in his private life, particularly towards the women in his life?
Yeah, he was, absolutely. He was, and there's a lot of that in the book. I've been coming to terms with this for a while, trying to figure out how to navigate that space, right? He was, he was abusive to his wife, to his mistresses, and they were very forthright about it in the records about him. So in the book there were conversations that happened about domestic violence, and it's coming straight from the archives. You know what I mean? So one of his mistresses said that he put his wife in a coma and then brought her. So Belle was his mistress. Belle said that he put Etta in a coma, then brought Belle to the hospital. He was like, "This is what happens if you don't listen to me." And so I'm going through and I'm thinking about the stuff I've been talking about, how this man survived, and then I run into those kinds of things. How do you deal with that? And so my first instinct was to take it out. I was like, okay, you know what, I can't even deal with this. I'm going to write this version of him that is larger than life and that's like the kind of hero story. But it just felt so disingenuous once I knew that those things were part of it. I decided just to put everything in that serviced the story. So there's not a lot of stuff about him eating breakfast or tying his shoes, but the events of the story, and then just step back. So one of the things that I hope I did in the book was not make judgment one way or another about the things, because I think that they present themselves as horrific as they should. Right? The other part of that, though, that I think is important is that he's following a pattern of behavior that is, so prevalent now. It was happening before he got there. And so it's important to use him as an example. Like, hey, look, this is this guy who's doing this. But he's not an anathema. He's part of a bigger conversation. And so I hope that it would be like, sort of pointing at him saying, that's really fucked up. What you did, we all know that that's wrong. But he's not the person that invented it. Maybe his dad did it, maybe his neighbor did it. And so they should all be complicit in this complaint too, you know what I mean? And so I hope that, and it feels like that's been happening, that the conversation is both about his behavior and also about the fact that this was so common in his time. This was part of it, like women couldn't vote yet, they could barely own property, they were married, as soon as they got married, the property got transferred, right? This is like real Neanderthal stuff. And so he is a part of a larger conversation, and he is complicit in his own action and very guilty of that. But he also is part of this bigger thing that is, I want to make sure that everybody gets pointed at, right? But that's complicated. When you start pointing fingers at people's grandparents and great-grandparents and saying, hey, you know what? Your great-granddad might have done this. People get really uncomfortable thinking about it like that. It's easier to look at Ray Rice and say, hey, you know what? This guy's a football player, of course. Or Greg Hardy, as if every football player decides to throw their girlfriend on a bed of guns and then go sign a contract with the Dallas Cowboys. I mean, it's abhorrent, right? And so I hope that in the book at least, serves to say, hey, look, this guy is in no way, no universe is he perfect. He's incredibly fallible. But he also did these other things, so what do we do with that, right? It was unfortunate-ish. The book came out around the same time Ray Rice, that video of him. You all know what I'm talking about, right? Where he just, it was just horrible. That video came out about the same time the book did, so it immediately became like a corollary. And I was like, you know, yes and no. Jack Johnson was around a bunch of people doing this. It was a messed up kind of behavior in his time, but different messed up. Ray Rice knew what he was doing. He looked around for the cameras and dragged his unconscious wife out of that elevator. Not better, not worse, just different and incredibly messed up. And so, yeah, I mean, it was maybe in some ways fortunate that those things could come out as part of his biography. And so I hope, at least when we look at the man, we look at him thinking about that too. I don't know if that answers your question. I went on longer than I meant to about it, but I'm glad you asked. Part of the reason I don't read those poems is I never felt like I could do them justice. The poems and the voices of his wife and mistresses, I never felt like I was there in the right way. When I wrote them, when I started writing the poems about domestic violence, at first I would write them when my wife or daughter would be out like at the park or something. They'd leave the house, so I had the house to myself and I'd work on it. But then they'd come home and it was like a rain cloud over my head, like a cartoon, walking around just miserable, because it's hard for me to imagine what would precipitate that kind of behavior. So trying to find a space to write about it in was horrible. It was so hard. So eventually I waited until I knew they'd be going all after me, and that still didn't work. So then I waited until they would leave town. And so I'd spend like 4 days while they were out of town writing these domestic violence poems. And then they would come back, and I'd like have one little eye and one big eye. And I'm like, just leave me alone. It's going to take a while to come back. But I missed you guys. I didn't want that energy around them in any capacity. So I guess that's my feeling about it. Because I couldn't even imagine it and have my family in the same house. Other questions? Yeah.
I just wonder if you could talk a little bit, as a professor, working with your students, and many of them not being familiar with Jack Johnson, and then you explained it and shared some poetry with them, and then they realize, oh my gosh, he's just like a celebrity black athlete, just like today. So when they start to put those things together and think about how the public or social media responds to the showman, like a Cam Newton, how people responding to him, or OJ, with the trial back in the 90s.
So I mean, I think that connection happens really quickly for younger readers. They see him and they already know that trope, right? I mean, if I say, hey, look, he's got gold fronts and lots of cars. He's got a wife, but he's got all these other women around him. It's like all these real stereotypical behaviors of contemporary athletes. And, of course, not all athletes operate like that, right? But enough of them do, so that when you see a guy with gold teeth and ride a fancy car, or like MTV Cribs, where the cars are fanned out in front of it, right? Like that was Jack Johnson in 1910. Like he's got his cars all fanned out. And people are like, there's only one other car in the city, and he's got 5 of them in his front yard, right? So I mean, I think that they're really comfortable making those connections. What's a little less comfortable for them is to understand just how different the universe was in 1910. I mean, and this goes across things. It's racial. Like young, not this is a huge generalization. It's not for everybody, but many young students of color have their own fight they're fighting right now, and they don't realize it's very similar to the fight that had already been fought. It was similar to the fight that happened before that, and so they don't know the history of the fight. Not all of them, but some of them don't understand that, so they don't They think about the Flash, they think about those parts of him. They don't think about the fact that he could have died every time he left the house. They don't think about the things that were happening to other African Americans at that time. So the historical context sometimes gets lost, and that's what we end up talking about. So there's the hinge, the quick, hey, you see this guy, you know him, look at him, he's enormous. He's handsome, look at all these things. He would have been a star right now. He was a star back then. He was one of the most famous people in the world, or infamous, right? But they see that connection. The things that kind of fall, where the connection starts to dissipate is when they try to sometimes connect slavery to him. I'm like, look, his parents were slaves. It's like slavery, Jack Johnson, it's like right here, but it's hard for them to understand how complex that handoff is. So more than anything, I think I spend a lot of time trying to contextualize history, more than I do him as a figure. And so I found out a long time ago that if I show him, it does a lot of the contextualization for me. If you can see him, see how much bigger he is than everybody else, and see him in action, smiling and doing these things, then I don't have to do all that setup. I can just kind of think about some of the other more complex issues, like his behavior outside of the room. Thanks for asking that. Any other questions, or did I exhaust you with this talk of oppression?
I'm just curious why Jack Johnson.
Why Jack Johnson? That's a really,
A lot of people you could write about.
Yeah. No. It's like, because Muhammad Ali was already taken. Okay. No, it's funny because when I was younger, I used to watch boxing with my mom, and she mentioned him to me a long time ago, but never explained who he was. Just said his name. And so maybe 30 years later, I was watching something on PBS. It ended up being Ken Burns' documentary, and I saw a picture of him. And I'm like, who is this guy? And so I just stopped the documentary, figured out it was Jack Johnson, and thought I would write an essay about watching boxing. And then somehow incorporated Jack Johnson. But the more I got into his story, and the more profound and complex it got, I realized that my silly essay about boxing, watching boxing, was much less important than trying to maybe reimagine his story for a contemporary audience, and to try to correct some of the misinformations around his history. And so it was a very humble, self-serving beginning that ended up, I feel like in a lot of ways, not having anything to do with me at all. I really felt like it was like, all right, the poems got infinitely more sophisticated and appropriate the further away I was from them. So the less I was involved in them, the better they got. There's stacks of poems where I was like, I want him to say he's sorry. I want him to do this, and they're terrible poems. But when I just let him go, it's like, oh, okay, that's a serviceable sonnet. I can work with that. So the further away I took myself out, the more I let him do this thing, the more true to the idea of the project it became. Yeah. I met Muhammad Ali a long time ago. So that's why I wanted to write about him. But Elizabeth Alexander, who's a really terrific poet, was the first inaugural poet for President Obama, wrote this series of brilliant poems about Muhammad Ali, and I just like, all right, so you got that. So I'm going to let you have that, and I'm going to go over here. Thing is that there are all kinds of poems about Jack Johnson out there. There's a great poet named Kevin Young who teaches at Emory. He's an Atlanta. He wrote this book about the painter Basquiat. It's called To Repel Ghosts, and in the middle of it is an 18-page poem about Jack Johnson. And so I'd read that when I was an undergrad, and I'm friends with Kevin. And so I stayed away from Kevin and his book for like 8 years. Because I didn't want his version of Jack Johnson to be part of the process. That's why I didn't watch Ken Burns' documentary either until I finished the book and sent it away. I didn't want Ken Burns to tell me which stories to tell. I wanted to figure it out for myself. And they were the same mostly, but I did the work on my own.
Were either of his parents still alive when he became famous?
His mother was, and he bought her this huge house in Chicago, where he got married in that house. They had this party that spanned like a mile, like just a square mile, and people partying for him when he won the heavyweight championship. So he was getting money, he was getting wealthy before he was champion. so he bought, the first thing he did was buy his mother's name was Tiny, and he bought her a house. And she put her house up as bond to keep him out of jail while he was on trial for the Mann Act. And so she forfeited it when he ran. But it's a parking lot now. They tore it down and built up some like 60s style office buildings, and then they tore those down. And so that's a parking lot. So his mother's house is not there anymore. Same thing happened to the nightclub that he owned, where Etta killed herself in this place that he called the Cafe Champion, and they tore that down, and it's a parking lot too. Thanks, Chicago. So yeah, so at least she got to see it. And she's in the book. There's some poems in there that just address his mother, because he often talked about how she was the inspiration for all of his successes and all of his actions. And so in the book, I've got a character who's a shadow that kind of argues with him. And so in one poem, he says, my mother was the inspiration for all these things. And the shadow's like, really? Even when you were choking your girlfriend? So I mean, so they think that there's at least, I hope, some opportunity to frame those conversations a little bit differently when you have 128 pages to do it instead of just a soundbite. Maybe one last, and then we'll see what maybe one last one, unless I talked you out. If not, because they have like food back there. Yeah.
You mentioned his interest in classical music, and when you talk about parallel to today's athletes, that seems to be a little bit different than what we understand about today's athletes. Can you talk a little more about how that fit into his story?
Yeah, it's because when I went into it, I imagined that he was going to be this great fan of blues music. It's totally like no basis, no historical understanding. That's why it's so long, right? Researching to write the book, because I didn't know anything about it. So like, oh sure, this guy must have loved blues. Not at all. The gentleman doesn't listen to the blues. The gentleman listens to classical music. So Jack Johnson is really big. I mean, you saw him in his tuxedo, straight up and down. He's a gentleman. That's what he wants to be seen as. Gentlemen listen to classical music. Gentlemen learn to speak French and Italian. These are the things that he wanted to do. He wanted to be a man of the world, not a stereotype of what a black man would have been in that point. So he's looking at that, and he's pushing away from that, and he's looking at these larger ideas. And also, our concept of blues music really wasn't in effect at that point, right? It's still folk music at that time. Jazz, the same thing. It's still folk music. It's not a thing that you could go buy a record and yes. That didn't happen until the 20s. So before that, classical music would have been that preeminent thing. But it's just weird that it was Verdi, it was Il Trovatore. And if you don't recognize Il Trovatore, you've heard it. Everybody has heard parts of Il Trovatore. It's in commercials all the time. Like there's this part of it called the Anvil Song, where they renamed it the Anvil Song, that they use for Animaniacs. Like it's all this kind of stuff. It's in pop culture, right? And so I was listening to it and it was hurting my head. It's not my thing. And I was like, why would he like this? That very question, like, why would he like this? And after a while, so I was like, wait a minute, okay, I see it now. I see it. And so there's a poem in the book that's written in the same cadences as the Anvil Song. It uses the lyrics from that as part of the poem. And it follows that same thing. So if you listen to the song and read the poem, it's like lyrics from the poem. Because those rhythms would have been the rhythms that would have made sense. You know?
I'm sorry, just quickly, when we talk about the money that was coming to him, where was that coming from?
So the money that was coming, well, you mean for the fights?
Yeah, did he have managers that were money managers?
He did at first, and then after a while, he just X'd them all out. He's like, I can manage myself. And they all sued him for X'ing him out because they're like, wait, no, you have a contract. So he had contracts with like 7 different managers, and they were all suing him. And so, a lot of times, his money would be put in trust because it would be tied up with lawsuits, and he could never get it. He lost, the equivalent of like $800,000 for one fight because he got tied up in legal battles, and then World War I broke out, and all the banks were dissolved, and so he never got this money. But his managers didn't get either. So because Jack Johnson was who he was, and there was such great enthusiasm and hatred for him, he was a big ticket idol. It's like Floyd Mayweather. He knew he could hold out, and get paid $56 million or whatever for one fight because he's both revered and loathed. Jack Johnson knew that too. He knew his value. And so he would hold out until they paid him. And so these backers, like wealthy sports people, would come around and say, okay, I've got $50,000 to put up for this fight. And so when he fought Jim Jeffries, who was the original Great White Hope, he got paid $100,000, he made $106,000, which was almost double what anyone had ever made for a fight in the history of boxing. And so that's a lot of money. I mean, it's like $2.5 million at this point or something, the way that they do it. But it was an insane amount of dough that he got paid, and he would go burn right through it, buying cars, buying furs and jewelry and things like that. And so, yeah, there was, I think maybe what maybe wasn't as apparent, and I should have worked at this, is that boxing was the most famous sport in the world back then. So there was a lot of money that poured into it, not like now where it's kind of the back of the bus sport. Thanks for that question. Well, thank you so much. I'm sorry I kept you for so long. Thanks.